Hey guys, so up to now, since Wednesday, the things we've been working on are going over the annotated bibliography assignment and kind of talking about some of those requirements, and also talking about plagiarism. And two of the ways that it can kind of get people is through paraphrasing poorly or patchworking actually instead of writing. So we talked about some of that gray area because it kind of feeds into the annotated bibliography a little bit. So today we're going to be focusing just on kind of breaking down how to write an annotation for a source within this genre. So we're going to talk about some of the genre conventions, tips, look at some examples, and then do some brainstorming so that you can get started on your own annotated bibliography. Get excited! So the first thing we're going to cover is just basic kind of genre information about the annotated bibliography. As we talked about in class, it is kind of a common academic genre. You'll have to do it in a lot of classes because for classes it does help you like gather and think about useful information about your sources before you use them. Really pay attention to what kind of expertise the author has, what kind of information is this source authoring, how is it going about making its point, how could you use it, that kind of thing. So kind of thinking through what sources are available to you before you get started. Researchers also compile these for other researchers. So it kind of serves the purposes. If I were an expert in, or becoming an expert in, video game violence, I could compose an annotated bibliography, which would be a list of potential sources with some information about each one that another person maybe looking for that information could go through my list and then say, okay, these two look good, I think I'll go read that. So it gives them just a list of sources. There's some common genre conventions. So I kind of want you to pay attention here. We're going to go through a couple of these. One, almost always, they should be in present tense. They should be written relatively objectively. You are going to include information like evaluating whether the source is useful, but you want to stay away from adding in your opinion. So, and we'll talk more about that coming up in a little bit, and also in future stuff as we kind of move into the digital essay. It usually explains the main purpose, the main points, and the main evidence. The point is main. They're very brief. Evaluates credibility and usefulness, so kind of lets readers know like where the information is coming from, and also what it adds to the research. It lets them know why they might want to look at it. And sometimes reflects. Some classes will ask you to have this reflection component, just kind of as a heads up for the future. I don't require the reflection component because we write reflections in different places, so I don't necessarily need it in the annotated bibliography. You are going to have three components. So you have a bibliographic citation, which is, oh, sorry, I'm just started kind of jumping around. Which is in either MLA, APA, or Chicago. You have the summary, which tells me what the source is about, a couple of sentences, then you have a couple of sentences of credibility and usefulness of the source. So a strong summary, at least in the annotated bibliography, is first going to have a strong first sentence. You don't have a lot of time, so you have to pack a lot of punch, like right off the bat. So the first sentence is going to give specific information. It's especially going to name the kind of source that it is. You would never want to say this source because that doesn't tell us if it was a TED Talk or if it's an art or if it was a study or if it was a blog. It's important to know what kind of text we're looking at. That's part of making the decision about how useful it is, and knowing what kind of content it is. So strong first sentence, and that first sentence is also going to give us the main point. It's going to tell us what the purpose of the source is. It should stay focused. Like we're talking like the main purpose, the thesis, main points. That's kind of about it. So how did they make their what was their main point? What evidence did they use to support it? Or what study was conducted? What were the conditions and what did it find? What was the event that happened and what are a few of the main details? Like just the kind of the main things. Stay in present tense, paraphrase. It shows understanding. We've already talked about this a little bit. Do not rely on quotes. We'll look at an example later that kind of shows in what cases like terms and phrases used in the article might be okay to put in quotes because they are issue specific, disciplinary specific terminology, that would be okay to quote, but otherwise stay away from direct quotes, put everything in your own words. And the last thing is to stay objective. We're going to do a lot of practice with this, just the difference between like when you should write from a remove perspective, and when you shouldn't, because there are different situations and different genres which is appropriate. In this genre, the goal is to stay objective, because your opinion on the issue isn't what's important in this kind of writing. A couple of ways that we're going to kind of practice this, go back, is using signal phrases or author signals, like according to the author, many supporters maintain. And you'll see how this kind of makes sense in a few minutes. We'll do some practice with it, so we'll kind of continue with that. Avoid evaluative terms, obviously things like this was a great article, or this book does a wonderful job, that kind of stuff. And avoid asking questions, as those are usually used to engage readers and also lead readers sometimes into a particular opinion or a particular way of thinking. So we're going to avoid those, at least for this particular assignment. And avoid personal pronouns. So I said sometimes it's okay to use I, sometimes it's not in annotated bibliographies, unless you're in a future class that requires you to write a reflection. It's not a good place to use I. We're going to talk for a few minutes about signal phrases and in-text citations. We actually talked a little bit about it in the previous presentation. It's something we're going to keep working on. One of the things that I've kind of noticed in the past is when people really struggle with integrating outside sources into their writing. A lot of times one of the big struggles is one with paraphrasing and with integrating those paraphrases with signal phrases. And getting really good with this one little skill can really make a big difference in how successful you are with research writing and how much easier it becomes. So it's one thing we're going to practice a lot, and I hope everybody will get really good with before the end of the 5 weeks. So one of the things it does, as we talked about, is that it creates those fences or frames around the information, so that, like the example we looked at in the previous presentation, I know where it starts because you say, according to the author, can you tell me the points the author made? Then you have the in-text citation at the end. And I wanted to show you just this kind of quick example. This is just a random excerpt from random scholarly article. But I want to show you, if you start here, in addition, many interests are interrelated and can play an important role in each other's realization. This is the author of this article speaking. And you can kind of follow it down all the way to here. So they go through an example and get here, and they say, equally, this person whose name I can't pronounce, Rossler, argues that, and then that's kind of when the quote starts. Ensuring autonomy. And you can kind of continue from there, and then the citation lets me know when it's done. So it creates this almost pretty fence where I can see this is where the information begins, here is the information, here's where it ends. So I know exactly where the author is in this text and where the author isn't, and that's what's important about a signal phrase, is it puts everything in its appropriate, puts all the opinions in their appropriate place, and it attributes them to the right person. You could keep going in addition, so they're kind of moving on, the author speaking now, kind of moving on, and it gets down here, they're referencing someone else. And you can kind of see how that works. Again, they use exactly the same method. And what it does is, and I know these are direct quotes, and yours are paraphrases, but it wouldn't work any different. I don't know why this is jumping around. Okay, here we go. If I were working with this one, I could paraphrase everything from here to here, and the only difference is the fact that it's paraphrased instead of directly quoted. I could use the same author signal, the same citation at the end. That would be how that would work. And it seems kind of simple when you look at it. It's a little bit harder to do it, I guess, from scratch with your own sources when you're actually writing about it, but that's kind of why we're starting practicing now. So then just to kind of go back and finish this up, author signals help make distinctions between the writer and the source, like the example we just looked at. It helps kind of introduce, if we weren't in anti-bibliography working on paper, which we will be, is going to help introduce direct quotes and paraphrases, so it's clear that you are integrating an outside source, and it attributes those opinions and actions to the appropriate party. So for this, because you're trying to maintain objectivity, using author signals is going to kind of help with that. And it's jumping around again. It's a standard expectation in academic writing that you would be able to do this, to be able to integrate this kind of information using signal phrases and author signals to do that and to make it clear. So to move on now, not from signal phrases, but to the next thing. This is an example of what it would sound like with the signal phrase versus no signal phrase. So the merits of cancer, and then revised with a general signal phrase would be doctors may conclude that. So you can use specific phrases which actually like name the author, the way the examples we looked at, or you can do general things like many people maintain, doctors may conclude, many people believe that. It still kind of makes sure that the reader knows that the opinion or the idea that being said isn't necessarily the one that you hold. So it kind of helps you kind of stay removed that way. So no signal phrase. However, the merits of cancer screening are currently debated by new data. And then here's a quote. Yearly prostate exams are not nearly as effective at reducing the risk of dying of prostate cancer as most men think. It's not clear where this is even coming from. It just sort of starts in a weird way. It's just very abrupt. If you revise this with a specific kind of signal phrase, you would have the same first sentence, then you would say, according to Dr. Dan Boyd, the director of cancer research at the Charlotte Clinic, who just produced one of the new studies on cancer screening, and then include the quote. Now I know who said it, I know what their background is, I have a little bit of context for that quote, and it makes a lot more sense now. And then this is just quickly an example from a previous student blog. So it's going to sound a little bit different, but it has kind of some of these so you can see. She had a hyperlink to the article here in hers. So she's got the author's name, and then she says who it is. When she gets kind of down to where she starts kind of referencing the article, she says, throughout her article, the article stated, Labasco, I think that's how you say that, also emphasized, according to CNN, and this is exactly how it would sound, how it would flow to be doing a really good job with this. So here is an example annotation from, and basically an excerpt from a previous student submission. Now the word count here is 164, which is actually a little bit more than what I've asked you guys to do, which is 125, which would be not including the bibliographic citation. It would be from here to here. It would be about 125 words. So this is an example. What I have highlighted is the summary. Okay, so this has the three parts: the bibliographic citation, the highlighted part here is the summary, and then the evaluation. So we're just going to look at the summary that's highlighted. So she wrote, in this article, Nestor Lopez Duran discusses a 2009 longitudinal study examining correlations between victimization and psychotic symptoms. Lopez Duran. So that's, notice in this first sentence, we know it's an article. She's got the author's name, says it's a longitudinal study and what it was examining. Packs a lot of punch. That's a good first sentence. Lopez Duran states that findings point to bullying as having different levels of consequences for victims. He notes that study results indicate that adults who have experienced psychotic disorder likely have a history of victimization, and that being bullied during childhood doubles the risk of developing psychotic symptoms. Finally, he examines, so I don't know why that got some weird font there, possibilities why these children are at high risk of developing psychotic disorders, and discusses dose response. So a couple of things, I'm going to stop there. A couple of things to note are the author signals at the beginning of each sentence to kind of make sure that it's the study that's saying this, it's the author that's saying this, and it also kind of walks us through how the author moves through the study and the findings and what they show. And then also has dose response. That's an example of what I was talking about earlier, the disciplinary specific terms and phrases that would be okay for you to quote. And then the last part of this is the evaluation. There's a lot less to talk about with the evaluation. Follows the same pattern as the summary in terms of the language, the tone, using author signals, all that fun stuff. What we're going to add is exactly what kinds of information you put here. So it's just a few sentences that answers the question, why should I read this? So it lets the reader know why this source is included. So is it because it's a scholar? Is it because it's a useful study? Is it because findings help explain a certain perspective? So give you a question of some examples of some questions you would ask yourself about this source to know what to put in this evaluation part. Does the author and or publisher have a credible reputation or a bias that the reader would maybe need to know about? Does the author and or publisher have a stake in the issue? So sometimes if it's a newspaper, it's worth noting what the political slant is for that for that newspaper, because just because it has a bias or it's not by a scholar, these don't necessarily mean that they're not useful sources to the conversation or understanding what people are saying about the issue. But it is worth noting because that information is going to be useful for the reader to know. Is the research specifically strong and credible? Does it represent a loud voice in the conversation, even if there's some bias? Let me explain. Maybe there's a documentary on Netflix that's super popular and everybody has seen it, but it's clearly biased, as many documentaries are. It would still be okay to include that in your annotated bibliography, but you would want to make a note like what some of the suspected bias might be, because that would be useful for the reader. It's still a loud voice in the conversation. People still watch it. They still have power. It's still worth putting out as a resource, but also that's what the evaluation is for, is to know where some of these problematic things might be. I'm sorry, I switched again. Is it older, but is there to provide background on the issue? So maybe your book sources, because it takes a long time for books to come out. So and it might be there because books do provide more like broad, complete information about an issue, and it might be there to just to provide some background. Does it offer primary testimonies or firsthand accounts of something? Does it explore a new theory or new solution readers might not know? Does it explore a particular perspective or set of concerns readers might need to understand? So there's a lot of things here you could ask yourself. You would not answer all of these questions in the evaluation, but you would want to ask yourself all of these questions in order to write your evaluation, and then pick 2 or 3 things that it would be useful for the reader to know. Avoid adding opinion, like adding your opinion about the issue itself, or discussing how you plan to use it in a paper, because you shouldn't be approaching it that way at this point. The annotated bibliography is for you to be hearing everybody out that's in the conversation, or at least as many as you can in a couple of weeks, and for you to be learning as much as possible, not for you to be planning ahead in an argument that we haven't gotten to yet. So no, here's how I'm going to use it in my paper. And then here is the end. We're going back to the example we were looking at before, except with just the evaluation highlighted. So from here to here, Lopez Duran is currently an assistant professor of psychology at the University of Michigan, where he researches mood disorders concerning children and adolescents. He also coordinates neuropsychology assessment services. Sorry, I don't know why I keep doing that. The University Center for the Child and Family, and is an editor for child psych research. So we know a lot already about who he is, not just what he's a professor of, or that he even is a professor and a scholar, but other ways he really has a specific kind of expertise in this issue. It's a recent study. It was a recent study. This was from like a minute ago. This is kind of an old example, but a really good one, so I keep using it. So it was a recent study, so that could be really useful. And the presentation of possibilities and symptoms aids in understanding how effects could be interrelated and mutually causational. So they kind of include at the end here just a final point about what kind of information is being offered and what it is that helps the reader understand more about the issue and what it adds to the conversation. The next thing we're going to move on to is practice and brainstorming. So please do this in your writer's notebook. And again, the writer's notebook is something that I don't always necessarily check, but you're welcome to use this brainstorming also to feed into the assignment that you're going to be working on next. So it can kind of help prepare you that way, and it kind of just walks you through the steps of brainstorming your first annotation for your annotated bibliography. And a bonus for doing this is not just that it helps you kind of with the next part of the assignment, but if you want to submit your notebook for notebook bonus at the end of the term, you can do that as well. So we're going to go ahead and get started. So kind of practicing on your own, you're going to find one source that you think might be in your annotated bibliography that's credible, useful, and again, there's some gray area that's available, kind of a spectrum with credible. When I say credible for this purpose, I mean it's useful for the conversation. You know who the author is. It's not a content farm. It's written by someone with either personal, professional, or academic, possibly expertise. So you're going to read over this text that you're going to add. And you're going to record the following just to get you started. Record the author name, title, date, and type of text it is. So sometimes when I say genre, I also mean type of text. Is it an article, a TED Talk, some other kind of video lecture? Is it a book chapter? Like what kind of text is it that you're offering? Because it might also help you make a decision about whether or not it would be useful to me. Second thing is describe the specific purpose or end game of this text. It kind of gets you started thinking about what might be in that first sentence. This isn't necessarily what you might write in your first sentence. But for instance, if the goal is to persuade the reader to do something, it might be to change their mind about something. Like, if so, what is it? Like, what is that point? And it kind of gets you started thinking about that first sentence that has to name specific information about the source and also what the main point is. So take a few minutes, you can pause and work on that. The next thing is to list those main points. So we said you want a couple of kind of main points or main pieces of evidence possibly, and I'll give you some kind of examples here. So just starting with a couple of questions. What are the main points the author makes to support that, what you said was the end game? So a tip might be to look through the text and pay attention to sections, subheadings. Sometimes that can kind of help you find that information. What important information does the author offer, or what other important text do they discuss? That might be something else that's useful. There are two examples here just to sort of help with this. One, perhaps the goal is to explore the results of a study. You would want to say like some main points about it, like who conducted it, where, characteristics of the group, conditions of the study, the results, and what the findings were. That's sort of the main details in a nutshell. Maybe, for example, too, the author is trying to persuade the reader to believe that a particular issue is a big deal, get people to care more about it by informing them. You would want to give a couple of points about how they did that. What were the big pieces of evidence that they used to do that? So give you a few minutes now. You can pause and kind of move through this as you need to. So for right now, and just kind of backtrack a second, you're looking at things for that first sentence. So specific information about the text and the main point, and also maybe a couple, 3 to 4, either conditions of the study, details of the event, evidence used to make the point, the things that are used to support that main thing. The next part is the evaluation. So step 1 for this is you're going to look up the author and publisher and make a few notes about their credentials. You have got to address author. It's the one piece of the puzzle that always matters, is the author's expertise, background, involvement, and or the publisher goals and reputation, potential stakes and biases, as we talked about, like maybe a potential like political lean, something like that. There's got to be an author that you can tell us about. Otherwise, we have no idea who's even responsible for the information. And it's one way to know whether or not you should be including it in the annotated bibliography at all. There should always be an author that you can look up and find more about, or there should be a publisher, organization, company, newspaper, somebody that is responsible for hiring that person that you can talk about. So there always should be a source of the information that you can find. 2 is a few notes about why you think it's useful, so that second part. And I've just included the some of the questions that we went over earlier that you might want to ask yourself. Is the research specifically strong and credible? So that's usually if it's a scholarly source. Does it represent a loud voice? So if it's a popular documentary or a popular blogger, that kind of thing. Is it an older text, using it for background? Is there any sort of primary testimonies or interviews or first-hand accounts there? Is it kind of going over new theories, solutions, developments that readers need to know? Does it help readers understand a specific perspective a little bit better? So try to list out maybe 2 other things that would be really useful for the reader to know. And then you're going to write a draft, okay? So take a few minutes. This should be about 6 to 8 sentences. We're looking at around 125 words for the whole thing. I want you to try to turn the notes you took into a formal draft of a summary and evaluation you could use to model the next 2 that you're going to write in the coming assignment. So you're going to stay in present tense, use concise language, so be brief, use your own words, avoid quotes, use signal phrases like the examples that we looked at, and avoid your personal opinion about the issue. Okay. So once you've done with this and you have a rough draft, hopefully you can go ahead and put that into your Google Doc with your bibliographic citation. And then, as you'll see in the next activity, I'm going to ask you for a draft of annotations for 3 sources. So bibliographic citations and annotations for 3 sources that are going to be in your annotated bibliography. So good luck.